So, you want to own a nuclear power plant. Here is the problem and the opportunity. Nuclear power produces the cheapest electricity on the grid per kilowatt hour once it is running, and it costs more money to build than almost any other structure human beings have ever attempted. Those two facts are both true at the same time, forever. That is the business. Let's talk about what it actually costs to get in. The smallest nuclear facility you can realistically consider is a small modular reactor, an SMR. These are the new entrant tier. NuScale Power, the first SMR company to receive design approval from the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That's the federal body that decides whether your reactor is allowed to exist. Projected costs of around $9 billion for a 462-megawatt facility in Idaho. The project was cancelled in 2023 after cost estimates climbed to over $20 billion before a single kilowatt was generated. That is your entry-level option. The mid-tier is a conventional single-reactor plant. The most recent US example is Vogtle Unit 3 in Georgia, commissioned in 2023. Original budget, $14 billion. Final cost, approximately $17 billion. Timeline overrun, 7 years. That is the optimistic case for a modern single-unit build in a functioning regulatory environment. The large tier is a twin-unit or multi-reactor station, Hinkley Point C in Somerset, England, currently under construction by EDF, the French energy company. 2 EPR reactors. Budget when approved in 2016, £18 billion. Current projected cost, £46 billion, with commissioning now expected no earlier than 2031. The smarter route does not require building anything. Several US utilities have purchased operating nuclear assets in the past decade. Constellation Energy, which operates the largest fleet of nuclear plants in the United States with 21 reactors across the country, acquired operating stations rather than constructing new ones. Buying an existing plant sidesteps construction risk entirely. You inherit the regulatory history, the operating crew, the fuel contracts, and the decommissioning liability. You also inherit a plant that is already generating revenue. Warren Buffett ran this playbook through Berkshire Hathaway Energy. Own the regulated utility, own the generation asset, collect the regulated return for decades. It works. It just requires patience measured in decades, not years. The one thing you cannot buy at any price is a plant in a jurisdiction that has banned nuclear power. Germany shut its last 3 reactors in April 2023. Those assets were not sold. They were legally demolished. There is no amount of money that gets you back into that market. Before you sell a single kilowatt hour, understand what it costs just to exist. A typical 1,000-megawatt nuclear plant carries a fixed operating cost of approximately $500 million to $700 million per year regardless of output. That is the floor. That is what it costs to keep the lights on before revenue enters the conversation. Break that down. The single largest line item is staffing. A nuclear plant employs between 500 and 800 permanent staff. Operators, engineers, security personnel, health physicists, and the administrative apparatus required by the NRC. Average fully loaded compensation per employee in the US nuclear sector runs around $130,000 per year. You are looking at $65 to $100 million in annual payroll alone. Before contractors, fuel is the second line. Uranium must be mined, converted, enriched and fabricated into fuel assemblies before it enters your reactor. The full fuel cycle cost for a 1,000-megawatt plant runs approximately $60 to $80 million per year, and unlike a gas plant where you can dial back purchases if prices spike, your fuel cycle requires 18 months of lead time. You are always buying fuel for a future refueling outage. You cannot respond to spot market. The purchase decision you are making today is for fuel your reactor will burn in 2027. Then there is maintenance. Every 18 months, your plant shuts down for a refueling outage. That outage takes 30 to 40 days. During that window, you are generating zero revenue while spending $100 to $150 million on inspection, maintenance, component replacement, and fuel loading. The NRC mandates the outage. You do not choose the timing, the regulator does. 1,000 megawatts sitting idle still cost roughly $1.4 million per day. That is the holding cost. Every day the machine is not running, you pay it anyway. Here is the analogy that makes the economics physically clear. Imagine you own a toll road. The construction cost was catastrophic. The legal approvals took longer than a generation. But once the road is built, every car that passes through pays you, and the road does not care how many cars use it. The marginal cost of carrying one more car is essentially zero. Your fixed costs are enormous. Your variable costs are almost nothing. Nuclear power is the same structure. Once the capital is deployed and the plant is licensed and fueled, the marginal cost of producing 1 additional kilowatt hour is roughly 2 to 3 cents. Coal runs 4 to 5 cents marginal. Natural gas runs 3 to 6 cents depending on spot prices. Wind and solar approach zero marginal cost, but they are intermittent. They produce power when the weather cooperates, not when the grid demands it. Nuclear runs at 92 to 93% capacity factor. It produces power around the clock, every day of the year, in all weather conditions. That is the mechanism. Catastrophic upfront cost, near zero marginal cost, near continuous output. Here is the inversion that most people miss entirely. The moment a nuclear plant is built and licensed, it does not compete on the electricity market the way a gas plant does. A gas plant is a variable cost machine. Its economics move with the fuel price. Your nuclear plant is a fixed cost machine. When electricity prices spike because a cold winter has drained gas reserve, or because a heat wave has pushed summer demand to record level, your nuclear plant is already running at full output, already selling into that spike at zero incremental cost to you. You make an extraordinary margin on weather events you did not predict and cannot control. The gas plant owner is celebrating the same spike, but paying elevated gas prices to capture it. Your economics in a price spike are structurally better than every fossil fuel competitor in the market simultaneously, and it gets more counterintuitive than that. In deregulated electricity markets, nuclear plants receive what is called a capacity payment, a separate payment just for being available, regardless of whether the grid is actually drawing power from you at that moment. You are paid to exist. You are paid again when the grid uses your output. The capacity payment exists because grid operators know that if your plant closes, there is no equivalent substitute. A 1,000-megawatt around-the-clock generator cannot be replaced by wind or solar without an enormous battery storage system that does not yet exist at a commercial scale. Your irreplaceability is priced into the market structure permanently. The mega-scale version of this logic is the entire French electricity system. France generates approximately 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, more than any other nation on Earth. As of 2024, France exports electricity to Germany, which shut its own nuclear plants and now runs on gas and renewables. Germany pays France for power. The country that built the plants sells electricity to the country that demolished them, at the margin, continuously. The two ways this asset destroys its owners are not the ones most people fear. Westinghouse Electric Company won contracts to build 2 AP1000 reactors, a third-generation pressurized water reactor design, at the VC Summer site in South Carolina, and 2 more at Vogtle in Georgia. Both projects began in 2012. By 2017, Westinghouse had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, with debts exceeding $9.8 billion. Its parent company, Toshiba, wrote down $6.3 billion in losses and nearly went bankrupt itself. Toshiba's stock lost more than half its value in a single year. The VC Summer project was cancelled entirely after $9 billion spent and 0 reactors operational. The CEO of South Carolina Electric and Gas resigned. The company was acquired. Vogtle survived, but at approximately $17 billion, 2.5 times the original estimate, 7 years late, and only because the US Department of Energy provided $12 billion in federal loan guarantees. Without the government backstop, Vogtle likely stops too. Construction risk in nuclear does not mean costs go up a little. It means costs can double, and the project still might not finish. Germany's nuclear fleet generated approximately 22% of the country's electricity as recently as 2010. Following the Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011, Chancellor Angela Merkel announced an accelerated nuclear exit. The 8 oldest reactors shut down immediately. The remaining 9 were placed on a closure timeline. E.ON and RWE, the 2 largest German utilities, were left holding stranded assets. A European tribunal eventually awarded them combined compensation of approximately €2.4 billion. The market value of the assets they lost was estimated to be considerably higher. When Germany closed its final 3 reactors in April 2023, those plants had a combined remaining operational lifespan of several decades. They produced 6,000 megawatts of zero-carbon baseload power. They are gone. No lawsuit recovers that. The government owns the regulatory apparatus. You own the hardware. When those 2 things come into conflict, you know who wins. The existential threat to your nuclear plant right now is not another Chernobyl. It is the uranium supply chain. Approximately 40% of the world's uranium enrichment capacity, the process of converting raw uranium ore into reactor-grade fuel, is controlled by Rosatom, the Russian state nuclear corporation. As of 2024, the United States is still importing Russian-enriched uranium to fuel its domestic reactor fleet, despite the sanctions regime imposed following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The US Prohibiting Russian Uranium Imports Act was signed into law in May 2024, but includes a waiver process that allowed imports to continue for specific contracts through at least 2027. Your plant's fuel supply chain runs through a country that is currently under a broad sanctions regime, actively fighting a land war in Europe, and whose state nuclear corporation is the single largest enrichment provider in the Western reactor fleet. The alternative enrichment capacity, primarily Urenco, the European consortium, and Orano, the French company, does not have the physical capacity to absorb the Russian market share in the near term. Centrus Energy, the only US-based enrichment facility, is operating at a scale but covers a small fraction of domestic demand. If the waiver process ends, if Congress closes the gap, your fuel contracts become complicated, your costs increase, and your refueling timeline becomes a question of what capacity is available on the non-Russian market, not what your plant needs. A reactor that cannot be refueled is not a revenue-generating asset. It is an extremely expensive building. The US nuclear fleet collectively is aware of this problem. It has been aware of it since 2022. The capital expenditure required to build out alternative enrichment capacity is measured in tens of billions of dollars. The timeline is measured in years. Your plant is not waiting for either. Here is what your plant actually earns across two scenarios. Your asset, a 1,000-megawatt plant in a deregulated US electricity market. Capital costs sunk, operating licenses held, power purchase agreement in place. That is a long-term contract with a utility or large industrial buyer at a fixed price per megawatt hour. Capacity factor, 93%. Average PPA price, $55 per megawatt hour. In line with contracts signed by nuclear operators with large technology companies in 2024, including Microsoft's deal to reopen 3 Mile Island Unit 1. At 93% capacity, your 1,000-megawatt plant generates approximately 8.15 billion kilowatt-hours per year. At $55 per megawatt hour, that is $448 million in annual revenue. Operating costs at the lower end, $500 million. You are roughly at break-even on operations before capacity payments. In PJM, the electricity market covering the mid-Atlantic United States, nuclear capacity payments run $50 to $90 million annually on a plant this size, just for being available. You are now profitable in your mature operating phase. With debt paid down, a plant in a supportive regulatory environment earns 15 to 25% return on equity. That is the business Constellation Energy is running across its 21-reactor US fleet, which generated $5.5 billion in operating cash flow in 2023. And it is the thesis Bill Gates is betting on through TerraPower, his nuclear development company, which broke ground on a 1,600-megawatt sodium-cooled reactor in Kemmerer, Wyoming in 2024. The first new nuclear construction started in the United States in over a decade. Construction overruns added $6 billion to your project cost. Your debt service is now $400 million annually. Operating costs land at the higher end, $700 million. Revenue at $50 per megawatt hour is $415 million. You were deeply negative before capacity payments. The capacity payment covers $80 million. You go back to the regulator and ask for a rate increase. In regulated markets, that is the only lever you have when costs exceed approved revenue. The Commission approves 60% of your request after 16 months. You absorb the gap in the interim. You are now at break-even. After 35 years of operation, you will recover the capital. Then the decommissioning bill arrives. Dismantling the plant, managing the spent fuel, returning the site to greenfield at approximately $1.2 billion, which you have been reserving for since commissioning, assuming the reserve fund earned the return you projected in 1991. Which brings you back to where we started. The cheapest electricity on the grid, the most expensive structure your money has ever touched. Both remain true on the day you commission it. Both remain true on the day you hand the decommissioning bill to your grandchildren. The plant that survives construction earns for 60 years. That is the only version of this business worth owning. The question is never whether nuclear power works. It always works. The question is whether you can afford to find out.